and welcome to Science with Mr. Morgan. In today's episode, we are going to be talking about adaptations. First up in our things to talk about are variations. Every organism is different from every other organism, and that means that there is variation between them. Every organism has different genes, which is why traits vary within a population, even of the same species. In one of the episodes on DNA, we touched on mutations. Now, many variations in a population likely come from mutations. So as a refresher, what is a mutation? It is just a random change in an organism's genes. And these can be triggered by radiation or chemical changes in the environment. Now, most mutations occur naturally and can be beneficial, neutral, or harmful for the organism, depending. Beneficial mutations may help with chance of survival. A higher chance of survival means a higher chance of producing offspring, which means a higher chance of passing on that mutation, that beneficial mutation. Again, offspring may be more likely to survive when receiving a beneficial mutation. But that's enough about mutations. Let's instead talk specifically about adaptations. What are they? Adaptations are characteristics that an organism has inherited, which may help it survive and reproduce in its given environment. Many of these protect organisms from the external environment. And one example of this is with cacti. Cacti have thick, water-retaining bodies which help them conserve water in harsh, arid environments such as the desert. Some adaptations can help organisms move or gather food. One example of this is reindeer, having sponge-like hooves that help them walk on snowy ground without slipping and falling. Some adaptations help organisms avoid being eaten. And one example of this is that some poisonous frogs have bright colors on them, which serves as a warning. Another example of this is that some non-poisonous frogs mimic the bright colors of poisonous ones to trick predators into thinking they're poisonous and shouldn't be eaten. Besides animals, though, some plants also have poisonous or foul-tasting substances that keep animals from eating them. One example of this is the smell of mint. It deters insects, and mice don't like the smell of mint either. Now that we've covered a few examples of adaptations, how do adaptations develop? Now imagine we have a population of oak trees, and suddenly a fungus has been brought from another country to here on a shipment of oak. In turn, most of the North American oak trees are killed by this fungus. But a few of the oak trees have a mutation which allows them to survive this particular fungus. Now, these are adapted better for their environment and therefore had a better chance of surviving. Now that these trees have survived the fungus, they can reproduce and are likely to pass on the favorable mutation to their offspring while the other trees have died. Once this happens, most of the new trees, the offspring of these, will have the trait to survive this particular fungus. Over time, traits that help an organism survive become more common, while traits that hinder survival will eventually disappear because they'll die out. If the environment is stable, species won't change and adaptation won't occur because it isn't necessary. If the environment is changing, however, the species need to adapt to survive because if they don't change with the environment, they're more likely to die out, aka not survive. The more drastic the changes in the environment, the more drastic the adaptations that will occur. If enough changes occur over time, something called speciation occurs. So what is speciation? Essentially, it's just the creation of new species. And this is something that doesn't happen overnight. It takes a long time for this to occur. And there are two main ways that speciation happens naturally. Both versions of this, or should I say variations, create a new species by reproductively isolating populations of the same species from each other. The two variations of speciation include geographic isolation and isolation without physical separation. Allopatric speciation is another term for geographic isolation. And this occurs when groups from the same species are geographically isolated for long periods of time. Examples of ways that this can happen includes the emergence of a mountain range, formation of a new canyon, formation of new rivers or streams, formation of new islands, right? If you have a volcanic eruption in the ocean, you can end up with new islands. Back to our pal Darwin. He observed 13 distinct finch species on the Galapagos Islands that had evolved from the same ancestor. And this is another example of allopatric speciation because different finch populations lived on separate islands with different environments. Because of this, these finches evolved to best adapt to their particular environments. Scientists were able to later determine which finches had evolved into distinct species by bringing members of each population together. The birds that could not mate and produce offspring were a separate species from the other. Now, another specific example involves Grand Canyon squirrels. Two populations of one squirrel species were separated by the giant canyon. After thousands of years in isolation from one another, the squirrel populations on the northern wall of the canyon looked and behaved differently from those on the southern wall of the canyon. The northern rim squirrels have white tails with black bellies, while the southern rim squirrels have white bellies and dark tails. Now, besides these physical differences, they cannot mate with one another. Therefore, they are different species because they can't create offspring. Now that we've talked about geographic isolation or allopatric speciation, let's talk about isolation without physical separation. And this is also known as sympatric speciation. This occurs when groups from the same species stop mating because of something other than physical or geographic separation. Differing behaviors of two groups in the same region is an example of such separation. And this may be caused by different mating seasons. Since this isn't based on something as definitive as being in a different location, it can be difficult to identify. One specific example of this, though, includes two orca groups that live in the same part of the Pacific Ocean, part of the year, but they don't mate with each other even though they're in the same area at the same time. They hunt different prey species, they sing different songs, and they have different social interactions than one another. A different example involves two groups of the Galapagos Island finch species that live in the same space, but each has their own distinct mating signals. Members of each group select mates according to different beak structures and bird calls. These behavioral differences kept their group separated until they eventually formed different species. And that brings us to the end of today's lesson. Until next time.